Welcome back to the conference on reimagining, reinventing police, and specifically to this afternoon's panel on the knowledge policy nexus. My name's Elizabeth Clemens from the Sociology Department at the University of Chicago, and I'll be moderating this session. So, over the past day and a half, an extraordinary group of scholars have spoken to the experiences of policing and being policed, as well as to the history and politics of policing. In this panel, the discussion will take a reflexive and reflective turn as our four speakers address questions of the relationship of scholarship to police policy and practice. What are the implications of different modes of inquiry? How are research findings understood and appropriated by community members, policymakers, and police themselves? What are the normative and pragmatic issues that shape the ways in which scholars hope to speak to policy and practice? I will introduce each of our speakers immediately before their remarks, and I look forward to what should be a lively, illuminating conversation as the final piece of this session. If you have questions for the speakers or for the panel as a whole, you may submit these using the question and answer button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So let me introduce our first speaker, Monica Bell, who is Associate Professor of Law and of Sociology at Yale University, titles that convey her commitments to both practice and scholarship. She has clerked for the U.S. District Court in South Carolina and been a fellow at the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia. As a scholar, she has published in multiple law reviews and social science journals, including a quintuply awarded paper in Law and Society Review on situational trust, how disadvantaged mothers reconceive legal cynicism. Earlier this year, much to my own delight as editor, the American Journal of Sociology published some of her most recent work, Located Institutions, Neighborhood Frames, Residential Preferences, and the Case of Policing. So, Monica Bell.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. And so what I'm going to do in my remarks is to say a little bit about, I'm going to talk kind of generally about guidelines, perhaps for collaborating with police and other criminal legal institutions to collect data. So, and I say guidelines, but I'm thinking more questions we as scholars can be asking ourselves. But I'm going to start by talking a little bit about a letter that a group of legal scholars and scholars of law and society, police, and prisons recently put together, which has thus far been signed by approximately 300 professors. And I'm going to talk about that as a way of thinking about an appropriate positionality for researchers working in these areas today. So the letter I mentioned was conceived of by a small group of law professors, most of us people of color, some of us junior, who have been studying and working on broadly how communities who are marginalized interact with the police and ways that that could be shifted fundamentally. And so, the letter makes a number of claims about the kind of historical positionality and kind of with American policing being a particular tool of racial control along multiple vectors. But critically, and important for this conversation, at the end of the letter, we discussed 3 commitments that we are making to ourselves and to each other with respect to our work in terms of scholarship, research, teaching, and service. And so the second commitment in the letter reads, we commit to disentangling ourselves from the prison industrial complex. This includes divesting ourselves and our labor from projects and events that support and legitimize police, Border Patrol, prisons, detention centers, and the surveillance of marginalized populations. So to unpack that, what does that mean? So does that mean not studying institutions that would generally be thought to comprise the prison industrial complex? No, Does that mean never collaborating with parts of the prison industrial complex for research? Not necessarily. I don't think it does, though I can't speak for the group, but it does mean that we don't adopt their goals as our goals. And this is a critical segue into other points I'd like to make about ways to think about working with police and the prison industrial complex for knowledge production as academic researchers. So first is that we can't lose sight of the role of the academic, which is to understand, but not to legitimize what police do. So we need research to understand what police do and what it means to them as well. But research, knowledge production, not legitimation of their goals is our goal as scholars. There are ways to be solidaristic with some goals of policing. So, I mean, think broadly something like the production of public safety while remaining separate. And so we also shouldn't assume that police goals are right. So this goes to the heart of some of the of one of the challenges, I think, is that historically, a lot of ways in which the university and the police have collaborated have been with a belief that and the kind of legitimacy of core police goals. So this idea of saying, oh, well, police are trying to produce public safety. They have goals of crime reduction. So, so while we may actually functionally be studying kind of what we see as the outcomes of policing, the actual way in which the work gets done assumes a shared mission, because universities also want, and academic researchers also want places to be safer. But that is not necessarily the case. And I think part of the conversation we've been having over the past 2 days reveals that to not be the case. And so we should not operate from a positionality of shared interest. This might sound kind of simple and simplistic, but if we think about the nitty gritty, right? So it's really difficult to avoid some bleeding of roles in the research process, especially when human relationships become involved. I mean, I do a lot of community-based research, and you develop relationships, and they tend to shape, in a lot of ways, the type of knowledge you're able to, the type of data we're able to gain. And they also shape, I think, how we theorize a lot of times in ways that we don't fully acknowledge all the time. Especially when collaborating with institutions like police departments, things become complicated because we're interacting with individuals, and some of those individuals are really good and have good intentions. And the relationships that are built matter. Critically, also, there are issues of access to data. And when researchers are collaborating with institutions that tend to be closed, the desire to retain access to data can often shape the type of work people do, the types of questions that are asked, and also the way we write about them. So there's a critical sort of reflection that has to go along with and be built structurally into the design of research at every step along the way, in order to make sure that the researcher isn't tempted, and the research institution isn't tempted to begin adopting police goals as our own. So that's that. I talked for a while about that, but that's the first point I wanted to make separately, which is keep retaining the role of the academic. The second point is about the potential misrepresentation of what we can do with social science. So we're social scientists. Social science is wonderful, but it is inherently, in a lot of ways, backward looking. And I think that's especially been true in the criminal legal space. This is something I recently wrote about, if you want to read in more detail, in a blog post for the Just Security blog called Black Security and the Conundrum of Policing. And essentially what I try to explain there is that our tools as social scientists are wonderful, but they're limited. And a lot of times when we write up our findings, and especially when we get involved with communicating those findings to a broader public, to policymakers, et cetera, because it feels really good to be taken seriously by policymakers, we misrepresent the power of our data. And critically, at a moment like this, and in a movement like this, sometimes we misrepresent what we can really speak to. So we are experts in what has happened. That's what social science can tell us. What has happened, we can study the results of things that have occurred. But there is we have a limited capacity to actually be able to predict what will work if it hasn't occurred. Of course, there are ways in which social science informs our knowledge about what's possible. We, of course, have to learn from the past. It would be ridiculous not to. But I think it's important for us. So, for example, when thinking about alternatives to policing, when thinking about interventions like transformative justice, there have been evaluations of some forms and iterations of these things, but we're not really equipped to speak in a broad-based way about their effectiveness vis-a-vis traditional criminal legal institutions. So that's number two. Don't misrepresent what we can do with social science. Number three relates to the previous point, which is that we can expand what we study. So we can collaborate with police departments, but maybe in that collaboration, we should also be thinking about studying alternatives. And there are numerous sorts of alternatives, right? So I don't want to get into a lot of details, but I presume there are a lot of people who are on this call who, haven't been spending decades studying police. So you know what? There are other things to study, but still focused around the same subject matter that could have more emancipatory potential. So that's one thing to think about. Next on my list is that social science researchers, and particularly research institutions, can do a lot of good and get ourselves out of the situation where we feel like we have to report findings in a particular way in order to keep access, by advocating for data transparency in general and not just for researchers' access. So that's access to the public, that's access to community organizations, that's access to policymakers, including transparency of police rulemaking. So one scholar, Barry Friedman, who's a legal scholar, has advocated, and also Maria Ponomarenko, they've advocated for notice and comment rulemaking and policing. Well, one thing that would be good if there was something like that is it would give the public more access to information about what police policies actually are instead of them being closed off. So that's one form of transparency that's really important from a research perspective, and also from a justice perspective. Secondly, police budgets. We know, generally speaking, what police budgets look like, but we don't know the details. And of course, that's variable across the 18,000 plus police departments. But, researchers have to contort themselves sometimes in order to retain access. And there are ways in which universities can be advocates for broader data transparency that would allow us to shift our relationship to really be more true to our commitments and goals as scholars. I think the fifth thing, there was one other point I wanted to make, but I think I'm going to kind of hold off on that one for now. But there's a final point, which is there are also ways in which, especially research institutions that collaborate with police departments, and of course researchers that collaborate with police, we can keep ourselves accountable by reporting regularly to community organizations and engaging movement actors as part of the overseers of the research, right? So a lot of times in community-based ethnography, people talk about these modes of accountability where it's like, I've studied this community and now I'm going to go back to this community and have them read the research. And we imagine that to be the case, of course, in the context of policing research, where we might go back to the police department. But critically, we should be going to other stakeholders, critically, and the community as being key stakeholders, to ask questions about the variables we're using, to ask questions about the constructions we're placing upon certain findings. And this relates to kind of this broader point, which is, I think in sociology often, we're not critical about the law that is being enforced. We view ourselves as just sort of studying variables that make sense, that studying and a lot of times what makes sense is what we have clear metrics of, but we should always be interrogating, why are these the metrics and what assumptions are built into the particular metrics and the data that I have available to me. So this is, of course, I mean, the classic example of this is kind of the crime statistics, and what's reported, but we don't have statistics on, or we often don't consider statistics on neighborhood safety that are broader than simple what crimes have been reported by to the police. So this is another way, by directly engaging with community members and seeking funding for that in our grants, we can keep ourselves more accountable in ways that will transform our research and ensure that it's actually academic instead of just legitimizing pre-existing institutions. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Jens Ludwig is the Edwin A. and Betty L. Berman Distinguished Service Professor at Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, as well as director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, among a daunting number of other administrative responsibilities. An economist by training, he has published widely and received many honors for his research on the intersections of crime and education with various dimensions of inequality. Most significantly for today's panel, through the Crime Lab, he's partnered with policymakers in Chicago, New York City, and across the country to use tools from social science, behavioral science, and a range of new computational strategies to identify effective and cost-effective ways to prevent crime and violence. So, Jens Ludwig.
So thanks so much for having me be part of this session. It's really terrific to be invited to do this, and I'm particularly happy to follow Monica Bell's comments. I agree with almost everything that she said, and in many ways, what I'm mainly going to do is just try and amplify and build on some of the points that she raised, and draw out a little bit more some of the tensions between some of the goals that she outlined. So I think in many ways, what we're kind of seeing with the conversation on this panel is part of a larger conversation about a shift in the social sciences more generally. So you can go back 50 years and see the statement by the then president of the Social Science Research Council, where he talks about, up through that point, the social sciences were really like the physical or biological sciences, where they're intellectual subjects directed primarily toward understanding rather than action. And so one metaphor for this is it's like the scientist looking through the telescope out into space, observing passively what happens. And what we've seen over the last 50 years are these tentative steps of social science to be more in the direction of actually directly, more in the direction of involved in the action, which creates new opportunities, but as Monica mentioned, also a variety of new challenges that I think all of us are still trying to figure out. And so here's just an initial list of some of the challenges that I've seen firsthand myself. One is the difficult financial incentives that sometimes can be involved in working with external partners. And I think this is not unique to social scientists working with police departments or government agencies. This is true of working with any external partner, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a medical provider, whether it's with a business. As Monica mentioned, there's a natural human desire to preserve partnerships. Many of the people in these other organizations are just regular people as well. And then all of us bring our own personal politics to social science topics as well. So we're struggling with a variety of incentive issues as we start to go out and engage in the world. And the other thing that this sort of new engaged social science highlights for us is an even greater need to invest energy into being more transparent than we normally are when we're doing social science research just sitting in our office. the need to be transparent about project selection, data analysis choices, interpretation, and publication, and what we're publishing, and why we're framing things the way that we are. So I think that list of challenges is daunting enough where I think it's reasonable to ask yourself, is it worth it? Is it worth sullying ourselves to engage with the real world? And I think one of the things that Monica wrote in her the blog post that she mentioned, I think really kind of highlights the limitations of status quo looking through the telescope and the new opportunities that arise with this new action-oriented social science. So as she said, it is really true that a major limitation of social science, the way we did this for 100 years, is we were exactly, as she said, limited to reporting on what had been done in the world. So if you sort of think about that as normal science, in many ways, the new social science is to the old science as like experimental physics is to theoretical physics in some ways. And that provides that opportunity to engage out in the world and change things, begins to let us sort of imagine and implement and understand new ideas, and in some cases, radically new ideas, as the current moment may wind up making possible. So let me just tell you a little bit about how this can work in practice. So here's the upside that I see, or an illustration of the upside that I see from going out and engaging in the world in this new type of social science. When I moved to the University of Chicago 12 years ago in 2007, we were in yet another terrible year of gun violence around the city, where there were enough school-age kids being shot in Chicago, where the Chicago Tribune could even run a news series counting the number of CPS kids shot every academic year. And that led to a lot of concern around the city, even then, about how we can reduce gun violence without having to rely on police or the justice system. So the very first project that the Crime Lab did was to hold a design competition to solicit best possible ideas for how to reduce youth violence from NGOs around the city. We formed a community selection committee. The program that we selected was called Becoming a Man, run by Youth Guidance. It was the brainchild of this amazing guy named Tony Ramirez Di Vittorio. He was working at Clemente High School at the time on the West Side. He saw a lot of kids struggling with some of the same things he struggled with growing up on the South Side. When you look at Tony running BAM, I very quickly realized he can do things that I could never even imagine doing. But there was one small thing that in my role as University of Chicago researcher, I could be helpful with for Tony, which is Tony really earnestly believed that this program he developed was helping not just the kids that he was working with at Clemente, but could potentially be much more helpful if delivered to many, many more kids around the city. The funding community had the attitude of, we've heard this a million times from every nonprofit around the city. How do we know you're actually right? And so that was one thing that we could actually help Tony do. We raised $1 million and gave it to Tony to expand to 12 high schools so that we could measure the impacts and see if it was as effective as he thought, with the goal of informing policy decisions about how we can achieve safety in a very non-traditional sort of way, at least historically speaking, for cities. Now, this is a program with a community organization, not a government, but I think there are two things that are worth noting. So for starters, there's a question, how do you serve something like 1,000 kids in Becoming a Man all across the city? How and where do you implement that demonstration? And it turns out that there would have been no way to do this without the intense cooperation of the Chicago public schools, so part of the public sector. And it also raises the question of how do you measure impacts? And it would have been cost prohibitive to measure the impacts from a large demonstration like this without the cooperation of both the Chicago public schools and the Chicago Police Department in giving us access to data to measure the impacts. Now, in this case, we had the very happy outcome of, in this first experiment during the 2009-10 academic year, seeing beneficial impacts from this community program. So there was a gain in schooling outcomes equal to something like a 20% increase in high school graduation, and a reduction in violent crime arrests on the order of about 50%. And the problem that Tony had had previously was that he would go to the funding community and say, I have this thing that I really believe works. This is a claim that, as I said, funders have heard over and over again. And now what we were able to help with is Tony could then go to the funding community, including the city, and say, now we actually have rigorous evidence that documents this is as helpful as we had expected. And that wound up leading to the city government. Normally when cities are under pressure to worry about crime, they launch some sort of get tough on crime thing. And in this case, Mayor Emanuel, who was in office at the time when the results came out, wound up putting tens of millions of dollars into Becoming a Man and other community groups around the city doing similar sorts of what you might think of as like mentoring type interventions. And that's been continued under the Lightfoot administration. And so from my perspective, as someone who wants to see the city get better, this, to the extent to which we played some small role in this, this feels to me like a win, and I think very aligned with the current moment's desire to think about alternatives to the justice system. One of the other things that engaging in the world made very clear to us that we wouldn't have been able to see had we just looked through the telescope is what policy people have come to recognize as a difficult scale-up challenge. And so on the x-axis in this graph, this is the number of kids Becoming a Man all across the city. And you can see that as the confidence intervals are fairly large here, and so we can't reject the null hypothesis that the effect is the same across different years as the program scale increases. But certainly suggestive evidence here that the effectiveness of the program might be declining as scale increases. And so what this highlights for us as social scientists is a whole new kind of scientific frontier question that we then have to work through, which will be particularly important if the current moment winds up redirecting lots of additional resources into the social sector. Now, the other thing that we decided to do with the crime lab, and I realize is not going to be a choice that everyone is going to want to make, is we decided to also work with government agencies directly, and this is a much more difficult decision. And some of the partnerships that we've had with public sector agencies have come out of community demands for changes from those organizations, and so I think this goes back to this question of whose goals are we serving? The last time we were in a moment like we're currently in with the Chicago Police Department was in 2015, 2016. And that led to a police accountability task force that made a bunch of reform recommendations that in turn also wound up with Department of Justice civil rights investigation into the police department and a consent decree between the police department and the Illinois Attorney General. It's not hard to see why there's so much demand around Chicago for this sort of consent decree and for it to be implemented effectively. So this is you can see in this graph, Chicago has a very distressing location on the y-axis, which is homicides per 100,000 people. The other dots are other cities around the country. You can see the enormous dispersion across cities in America. And we also have a very distressing number of fatal police shootings per 100,000 in the city as well. And so I think everyone around the city has the shared goal of trying to get Chicago to be as close to the origin point as possible. And you can see, indeed, there are many, many cities that are doing much, much better than we are, which highlights the potential. I think the other reason that you can understand there's so much concern about effective implementation of a consent decree, and this is, I think, the key thing that's driven so much public energy in cities around the country the last couple months, is the enormous racial disparities and discrimination in police use of force. This is something that's been hard for social scientists to exactly quantify for a long time because the data has just been very difficult to get. Researchers at Texas A&M recently wound up being able to link 911 data with police use of force data and officer characteristics in a large anonymous US city. I don't think this is Chicago, but I actually don't know what the city is myself. And they took advantage of a natural experiment here where basically the next 911 call that comes in basically gets randomly assigned to a white versus an African-American police officer in the city, and that winds up leading them to respond in a neighborhood that is either relatively more African-American or relatively less African-American and more white. And what you can see in this graph and their key results here is the blue dots at the top here are use of force by white officers. The red squares are use of force by African-American officers in the city. And you can see the left part of this graph here is the most predominantly white neighborhoods. And you can see that white officers are more likely to use force in white neighborhoods, but only modestly so, or moderately so, maybe would be a better way to say it. But as you look at police response in predominantly African-American communities, you can see that this moderate gap in police use of force between white and African-American neighborhoods turns into a chasm. And for me, this is the best evidence that we have, the starkest evidence that we have so far about the enormous role of what lawyers would call disparate treatment in police use of force, which makes getting the consent decree right all the more important in my view. And also in my judgment, I think that there's an important contribution of data and social science that could be made to doing things like implementing the consent decree as well as possible. Now, that suggests that there's some sort of value proposition here, some upside potential from partnering with public sector agencies like the police department, like the public schools. The fact that there's a value proposition by itself doesn't mean that it's worth doing, because we still have left unresolved these real world challenges that I mentioned at the beginning and that Monica talked about during her presentation. And I think different people are going to reach different conclusions about whether that trade-off is worth it and whether they believe they can navigate the real world challenges. My own judgment here was the importance of the social problems that we have in the city and the centrality of so many of these big government agencies in contributing to those social problems made me feel like the most likely way we could do our part to make the world a better place is to partner with the agencies. But I recognize that everyone is going to wind up with a different conclusion. That leaves open the question of how we can navigate these challenges. And I think, let me just say a minute about a few of these challenges and how all of us who want to engage in this new social science for action, the particularly difficult challenges that we're going to wrestle with. So nobody knows better than I do the enormous difficulty of fundraising for this sort of work, for anything in the social sciences. And so it's enormously tempting to take money from the city agencies themselves. We did this once with the city of Chicago and immediately recognized it was a mistake and haven't done it again. Since then, everything that we've done, and I think this is a larger lesson for all of us doing this sort of work, I think it's just critically important for us to rely on third-party payers, third-party sources of funding for doing this sort of work, so that the government agencies are partners, not clients. I think that's absolutely central for this sort of work to have integrity. And I think that's going to be increasingly difficult as we move forward, as the economic repercussions of the pandemic make fundraising all the more difficult, but I think it's just absolutely critical. I think the other thing that seems particularly important for all of us doing this sort of work is to invest much more of our time and effort into being transparent compared to what we're normally used to doing office research that involves sitting in our office. So, for instance, one of the things that I have had to learn how to do in working on the crime lab over the last 10 years is interact with a bunch of what you might think of as government watchdog agencies that provide one sort of check, not just on the government agencies, but I've come to realize can also be a useful check on us to keep ourselves honest and to help promote the goal of transparency in what we're doing. And so we've started to spend more and more time talking to organizations like the Inspector General in Chicago and the independent monitoring team around the consent decree. The other thing that I've had to teach myself to do is, most of the academics that I know hate to talk to reporters. We'd much rather just do our work. One of the things that I have realized I have to spend more time doing is spending time disseminating information about what we're doing. I think Monica is absolutely right that better still would be direct outreach to community organizations in a city of 2.7 million people with hundreds, if not thousands, of community organizations. How you do that effectively, given resource and time constraints, I think is a big challenge that we're still trying to work through. Kind of an imperfect substitute that we're trying to use in that direction is to make better use of technology to do that, including our website, as imperfect as that currently is. All of that, I think, that's investment in transparency that's much more than we're used to doing as social scientists, but it sits on top of the normal sort of mechanisms for transparency that social science in general has already developed. Things like pre-analysis plans, to keep ourselves honest in the research studies that we do, so what we wind up publishing, so we don't have a file drawer problem. And on top of things like archiving data so that they're available for secondary analysis, and on top of the university's own internal control mechanisms like University Research Administration, where we have IRBs and data sharing agreements that keep track of everything that we're doing and giving the university visibility on that. So in closing, we made a particular decision that we think that we can do more social good partnering with city agencies than walking away. I realize this is not going to be for everyone. One of the most striking things we've seen in the data over the last 60 or 70 years is bipartisan plummeting in trust in government. I think the good news here, we've made one decision, but there are lots of other actors in this ecosystem that are trying to reform the criminal justice system. There are people who push government agencies to change what they're doing from the outside. There are people using different research methodologies like qualitative work. And there are frontline practitioners like the Trauma Center that act as a bridge between social scientists and the frontline. And I think in this ecosystem, like most ecosystems, the whole thrives when we have diversity of approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens. Our third speaker is my colleague Steve Raudenbush, who is the Lewis Sebring Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology. Who is the Lewis Sebring Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology at the college and the Harris School of Public Policy. He also chairs the university's Committee on Education. Widely published and yet another multiply honored scholar, he is both a statistical innovator and a leader in thinking about processes of education as they operate in nested settings of classrooms, in schools, in neighborhoods, in cities. He's been deeply involved in the research on and evaluation of major projects of school reform in Chicago, and has also served as an expert witness for the University of Michigan as they were involved in a case over considerations of race in academic admissions at the university level. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Liz. I'm going to see if I can get this up first. And I want to know, can you see my overheads?
Yes.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Liz, for that introduction, and thanks, Julian, for inviting me to this session. I have spent a fair amount of time in my career studying neighborhoods and more studying schools, and some studying them together. My work on neighborhoods is probably more like the work that Monica Bell described earlier, looking backward at things, looking at things as they are, or maybe, as Jens said, looking back through the telescope. Some of the work on schools is a little bit more of the type where we're trying to imagine new ways of doing things and figuring out how to do things better. And so I'm going to see if I can make some sense out of those two parts of my life that might be of use to this panel. I'd like to start, though, with a personal note. So back in June 3rd, 1967, showing my age here, my late wife, Stella, was working as a social worker in Roxbury. And she was very active in the welfare rights movement there. There was a major sit-in of welfare mothers at the Grove Hall, Roxbury welfare office, demanding to be treated with respect, really, more than anything else. The disrespectful way they felt they were being treated was humiliating. And so the police came. They broke through the windows. they grabbed the women by the hair, dragged them out, beating them with batons. And as they were doing this, a crowd began to gather, larger and larger crowd, composed of the sons, the brothers, the partners and fathers, and other people, some women, but lots of men. The crowd grew to the size of 1,000 watching the spectacle. And at some point, a tremendous hail of stones fell upon the police, whereupon what followed were 3 days of warfare in which scores and scores of African Americans were killed. Much of the Black section of the city was set on fire, and it never really, the commercial section really never came back. A lot of the residential section slowly has come back. So that was on my mind on June 3rd of 2020, when in my hometown of Minneapolis, I was watching with horror the murder of George Floyd and the rebellion that followed, which also included considerable amount of arson and but not so much loss of life, very different. But I was asking myself, this is what is this, 53 years later, have we made any progress at all? What's going on here? And it took me a while, partly talking to my relatives in Minneapolis, to realize things were really, really different. And the main difference was the tremendous support nationally that the Black Lives Matter movement had compared to what happened in '67. What didn't change, of course, was the continuing police brutality. This has gone on continuously from '67 to the present, but what was different was the political movement. And so the outline of my talk is, we have an opportunity for a social movement that can be very powerful, much more so than we were able to have in 1967. And I want to make the case that part of that opportunity should be the fight for public safety. And I want to say something about the role of research in that fight. And I guess the theme is that the social movement creates a tremendous demand for action. The demand for action creates a demand for information, and that's partly because of the conflict of ideas that comes out of the demand for action. So then we become actors in supplying the information that becomes in more demand. And we don't, as Monica said, we don't want to overplay our role as change agents, but providing evidence, evaluating arguments. So let me say something about policing in Chicago. I think it's very important to realize that neglect, the idea that neighborhoods are not worth defending, the people are hopeless, can't be helped, and we shouldn't really try hard, is the opposite coin of abuse. These are two sides of the same coin. I mentioned John Burge, Homan Square, Laquan McDonald in Chicago. So the demand for public safety, I loved Jens's graph that had the victims of violence in the neighborhoods on one axis and the victims of the police on the other. The demand for public safety is a demand on the police to stop hurting, harming, killing people, but also a demand of the society for protection. So we know that there are devastating effects of exposure to violence. The collective trauma that we've been seeing of children being killed in their mother's arms is overwhelming. The data that we've been able to collect on the effects of ambient violence on maternal health from the Moving to Opportunity experiment, for example, but from other studies as well. The effects on student learning, the effects of large levels of violence on the disinvestment in communities, and the outmigration, which we've seen heavily, particularly among African Americans, 200,000 people leaving the city of Chicago in the last 20 years. This is very important because any movement to improve life is a movement to improve mental health, to improve learning, to improve housing, and to improve investment, and bring people into a city that they can live joyfully in and productively. And such movements to improve those things must be accompanied by movements to improve public safety. So people think stereotypically about public safety. They think all neighborhoods of a certain type are dangerous, or they might think that things don't change over time. The absolute opposite is true. There's enormous spatial variation in the city of Chicago in violence. So I go back to a study with Rob Sampson, Tony Earls, back in '97, homicide rates in 342 neighborhoods of Chicago ranging from 4 to 105 per 100,000, just vast variation. Now, here's the stereotypical part. The best explainer of this is not poverty, by the way. We can talk about this during the discussion. Poverty is not such a big predictor about what we call concentrated disadvantage, which has to do with joblessness, unemployment, and importantly, a concentration of single-parent families. The poorest people in the city concentrated, segregated in very small areas of the city, which makes it difficult to do things, to make places safe, that we can talk more about. So part of this variation is explained by this idea of collective efficacy that I think many people on the call are familiar with, which is the idea that in neighborhoods where people know each other, trust each other, share common values, and where they can count on each other to intervene to protect order, that in such neighborhoods we have dramatically lower levels of crime and violence. And that's true even for neighborhoods that are high in concentrated disadvantage. And I might say that even the neighborhoods that are high in concentrated disadvantage and that have the same level of collective efficacy, there's still vast variation in the violence rates of those cities. So people are agents on the ground, creating public safety, trying to do it, being more or less successful. And we call that informal social control, interacting with the police, whose activity we view as horrendous at this stage for good reasons, but in fact historically does seem to vary in certain ways in terms of the capacity of people in the police to form some kind of working relationship. The other kind of variation that I've been learning from my colleague Rob Sampson and Roland Neal is the tremendous variation over time in crime and violence, so that a child turning the age of 20 in 1995 was more than twice as likely to be arrested than similar child in 2010. And really I'm talking about kids who are very high-risk kids by all of the predictors that we have. So it's a different world growing up in 1995 and 2010, a tremendous drop in crime that we need to understand better. The reason I emphasize this variation is there's potential malleability in public safety, and there's an agency of people on the ground. But of course, we have to get the policing right to really activate that and make it work. So the question then comes, how do we improve public safety? And in the debate about the police, and maybe we should defund the police and we should put more money into other things, and maybe we should try to fix education, we should get more jobs, we should fix health, etc. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a false dichotomy, because it's very hard to do any of those things without simultaneously improving public safety. So it's very hard to create jobs in a community when people are afraid to start shops because they're afraid of being robbed, can't buy insurance. It's hard to massively improve education if kids can't walk to school safely. So we got to have public safety. This is part moving toward my education theme a little bit more. It's hard to support family functioning when people are keeping their kids in the house because they're afraid of them going outside, and that can create more conflict. We have research on that. One of the really bright spots in the research that I see is Robert Vargas's book, 2016. And I'm not sure Robert will agree with my reading of his book, but my reading is that political mobilization in part of Little Village had a tremendous effect on the collective capacity in the west side of Little Village of people to shape their environments, including public safety, including other aspects of their life. And I was excited about that study in part because it was the first one I'd seen where there was a really good theoretical connection between some activity that you could engage in that would actually improve collective advocacy, namely political mobilization itself as being the independent variable. So, but as I say, all of these things that we might try to do, it's not a question of should we do this or that. We have to fight on every angle, but the other fights, schooling, housing, neighborhoods, families, are undermined by violence, and violence can be undermined by success in those domains. So let me just say something about, which is really, I know, the topic of this particular session, which is kind of how do we learn? How do we organize ourselves to learn? And I mentioned studying political mobilization. But I want to agree with Jens Ludwig that studying attempts to improve systems has got to play a crucial role. And there's a risk in trying to generalize from working in education to working in the police area. But I do want to share the experience of the University of Chicago over the last 30 years being engaged very closely with the Chicago Public Schools in a research practice partnership that was fraught by all of the challenges that the previous speakers have mentioned. And that includes the fact that the CPS control the data. If they don't like the findings, they can shut you out of data. That's the most important one. And so the question of how do you maintain independence in this relationship? And that's something that the consortium at Chicago over the last 30 years has worked very hard on. And there's some rules of engagement. One of the rules is the CPS doesn't control public. One of the rules is that there's an agreement a priori on what the research questions will be. That's crucial. A second one is that the Chicago Public Schools do not control or censor the publication of the results. Another rule is that there are no surprises. That is, the Chicago Public School officials will always learn about the findings before the press does, and with enough time to think about how to respond, so that it's not a question of being confronted in a press conference with a finding that you don't know anything about and being deeply embarrassed. And that's just not right to do to somebody who's supposed to be your partner. So, there has to be a working relationship. And then the idea would be to review the findings and to develop new questions based on what's been learned. And there were many, many times when it looked as if the consortium would be just put out of business because its findings were too stressful for particularly Paul Vargas when he was the superintendent of schools. And somehow this thing lasted. And the consortium gained a wide range of civic support from parents, teachers, and the philanthropic community, and in fact, really the school leaders themselves. I think Arnie Duncan was very important in this, but Janice Jackson feels the same way, such that it would be very difficult to take the data away from the consortium because the way it had comported itself. And it's interesting to note that the Chicago Public Schools, which the Secretary of Education Bennett back in the Reagan administration called the worst school system in the country, is now regarded widely, and this partly due to Sean Reardon's work at Stanford, comparing school districts longitudinally over the country, as being one of the very most improved school systems in the country, doing remarkably well for the students that it has. Not anywhere near what we want, but the graduation rates, the learning rates have gone up, controlling for the demographic change in demographic background of the kids. And I don't know whether it's fair enough to say this. I don't think we can say this in any rigorous way, but there is at least a perception on the part of the school leaders that the partnership with the consortium has played a critical role. I also want to mention the University of Chicago charter schools, and I think it's important because by starting, and Tony Breich, my colleague, longtime friend, started the first charter campus in Chicago in 1998, and there are now 4 schools that the university operates. We can study the impact of these through a randomized assignment. We wrote a book on this, Hasrick, Raudenbush, and Rosen. I have to plug that book, UC Press 2017, and we show a couple things. One is tremendous gains of the kids attending the school. And by the way, we were able to use a randomized lottery where we can use the consortium data to follow the winners and losers of lotteries so that we have an unbiased estimate of these gains. And moreover, when these kids leave elementary school, we see and not only no evidence of fade out, the gaps actually increase more. And these are all Black schools serving 85% low-income kids. The reduction in Black-white achievement gap in Chicago attributable to this intervention is really quite remarkable, and lays to rest, in my view, any evidence, any feeling a person might have about the incapacity of families in these neighborhoods or children to make dramatic growth in learning. So I guess I think that having the charter campus is important as almost a complement to working in the partnership with the broader school system, because it gives a chance in a situation where we can actually control the practice to some extent, some large extent, and try to see how well the kids can do. It's a real test of our knowledge. Do we know how to put an effective school together? I might add, we know that sustaining the effectiveness of these schools is a big, big challenge. So I'm not sure how applicable the rules are of what I've, or the example is of what I've mentioned, but I do want to emphasize.
Steve, can we wrap up?
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is public safety is a crucial goal for any movement, and it's intertwined with the others, and we should work together in the different sectors on making change.
Okay, thank you for that. And with 4 panelists on this session, we're particularly pushed for time, and there are a ton of questions in the queue. So let me introduce our final speaker, Robert Vargas, who is Associate Professor of Sociology in the college at the University of Chicago and has been a visiting scholar at the American Bar Foundation. His multiply awarded first book, discussed by Steve, was Wounded City, a compelling account of how the local politics of Chicago, specifically the drawing of ward map boundaries, has shaped the configuration of violence and policing in 2 adjacent and in many ways similar communities. Supported by an NSF career grant and a deep engagement with novel approaches to computational spatial analysis, he is now extending the argument through a historical political economy of urban violence in New Orleans, San Francisco, and of course, Chicago. So to Robert.
Thank you. Before starting, I want to thank the UChicago undergraduates in my policing course who inspired me to think differently about policing, because like many of my colleagues, I was deeply skeptical about calls to abolish the police. However, after careful research, I'm now convinced that this moment requires not only dismantling, but transforming the relationship between universities and police departments. And I'll begin with what we need to dismantle. At stake in the current moment is not just a policy research nexus, but a finance policy research nexus. Private companies are increasingly contracted to perform services previously carried out by officers or civil servants. This structure, which embeds financial institutions in the creation of public safety, means that profit is at stake in current discussions over police reform. This graph shows the top 25 private companies who received payment for a service provided to the Chicago Police Department. The dollar amount paid by the city to these hundreds of private companies over the last 19 years, and these data come from the city data portal, amounts to a total of $388 million. And this figure continues to grow. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to discuss why we need to dismantle this institutional configuration, what specifically we need to dismantle, and what alternative institutions we need to build. Now, why dismantle this? The answer depends on where you're coming from. From a researcher's perspective, this inhibits data sharing and research transparency, which are crucial for scholars to evaluate the effectiveness of police interventions. From a university administrator perspective, the finance research policy nexus delegitimizes the university in the eyes of communities subjected to police abuse, torture, and corruption. A prime example of this involved the video footage of the Laquan McDonald shooting and the years of painstaking work it took to have that video released publicly. The barriers that institutions raise to prevent data sharing and transparency is a form of violence inflicted on hyper-police communities fighting for justice in the face of police misconduct. Lastly, for wealthy university donors and boards of trustees, dismantling the system is important because we are in a moment that sociologists call a legitimacy crisis. This is not a problem to be solved like an equation. It is a project of restoring the legitimacy of institutions to citizens. Failure to restore legitimacy only further escalates violence and state repression, as well as violent resistance from members of marginalized groups. Legitimacy crises produce toppled governments. Dismantle what exactly? Private and publicly traded companies selling policing technologies, limited liability corporations, and private research labs. I will go into more details on each of these. First, professors like UCLA anthropologist Jeff Brantingham are founding private companies to sell predictive policing technologies to police departments. These technologies rely on faulty data to produce statistical predictions of crime locations that inform where police are assigned. Sarah Brain's talk yesterday described how these very technologies not only fail to make citizens safer, they further criminalize minority communities. But the most troubling aspect of these private companies are the barriers privatization has on data transparency. In an article on Vice News, the CEO of Predpol was asked to list the cities where they're selling services. In response, the CEO replied, they do not disclose confidential metrics, including customer lists, for competitive reasons. Here is where the financial conflict of interest creates a serious research problem. As a researcher, it is impossible to properly evaluate a technology aimed at providing a public service when private firms are incentivized not to share their data. Put another way, the public has no choice but to place a blind faith in the data and expertise coming from the private research labs with proprietary data. And that's just too much power for any one particular lab to have. Limited liability corporations are another problem. The Chicago Police Department has paid $28 million to LLCs over the last 5 years. They're a problem because LLCs allow individuals to receive payment from CPD as a way to maintain their anonymity. LLCs are not obligated to report their members. A researcher asked to provide a service or evaluation of the police department can cover their tracks by creating an LLC listed under a nominee. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the ways that LLCs or consulting firms were employed by economists to publish research papers, funded by investment firms that propped up mortgage-backed securities, the very instrument at the center of the financial collapse. LLCs make it impossible to detect a researcher's financial conflict of interest, especially when working with police departments or policing technology companies. Two publicly traded companies received contracts from Chicago Police Department. And in this talk, I focus on ShotSpotter, which sells technology that identifies gunshots to improve police response times to shootings. As recently as June of 2020, in the midst of demonstrations all over the country, Yahoo Finance published this article advising investors to buy stock in ShotSpotter. The author wrote, quote, "Police reform has become a new cause during the George Floyd protests. Here are two stocks that could benefit." This reveals a wider set of stakes in police reform. Investors with the most stock in police technology companies have money to lose. The same is true when it comes to funders of ShotSpotter, because when it debuted under Rahm Emanuel, it was funded through a combination of public and private funding. The only private individual to publicly disclose his financial support of this technology was Kenneth Griffin, CEO of Citadel and a member of the Board of Trustees at the University of Chicago. This map shows the locations of the 7 firms with the most stock in ShotSpotter. This visualizes how more than just Chicagoans have a stake in Chicago policing. Multinational firms invested in Chicago policing technology also have a major financial stake. Finally, our private research labs, through their proprietary data agreements with the Chicago Police Department, delegitimize the universities they're affiliated with to communities, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, and researchers seeking alternatives to policing. For example, the 2019 consent decree issued by the US District Court wrote that, quote, "CPD will maintain its partnership with the crime lab or another service provider to create an early intervention system aimed at preventing police misconduct before it happens." Creating such a system requires easy access to sensitive personnel data from CPD, data that nonprofit organizations, journalists, and academics have spent years filing Freedom of Information Act requests to acquire. This partnership with the police department that is actively trying to erase misconduct records and miss consent decree deadlines is corrosive to the university's standing in Southside communities. The exclusive partnership between a private research lab and the city weaponizes data and bounds debates over policing to concerns about bad apples and early intervention systems, rather than a focus on institutional transformation or abolition. This weaponization of science to insulate the Chicago Police Department dates back to the 1960s, when Police Superintendent O.W. Wilson, a Berkeley-trained criminologist, began using statistics to shape the media narrative about crime. This strategy enables police departments to deflect responsibility when violence increases, then use their bully pulpit to take exclusive credit for declines in violence. Today, UChicago's collaboration with the Chicago Police Department blurs the boundaries between public and private enterprise, as the funding to install new surveillance technologies or evaluate them come from similar private-public funding sources, namely city government and private wealthy philanthropists. This month in Bloomberg News, Kenneth Griffin called for the US government to uphold trust in markets by requiring foreign countries listed on the US stock exchange to maintain transparent accounting practices. Just as financiers demand transparency with respect to foreign companies investing in the US, it only follows that citizens ought to demand transparency from companies and private research labs collaborating or investing in the police departments. Here are some examples of alternative institutions that researchers and universities can follow moving forward. The first are interinstitutional collaboratives. Groups like the Square One Project in New York are composed of policymakers, police, nonprofits, community organizers who engage in difficult conversations like the ones we're having now, and work toward building a collaborative agenda for transforming the criminal justice system. N3 at Northwestern works with community groups as co-principal investigators and co-designers of research instruments. Chicago Beyond is a philanthropic organization that published a great report titled, quote, "Why Am I Always Being Researched?" which describes the inequities and ethical dilemmas built into research partnerships with communities or government agencies. If you're looking for a guide on how to build equitable and ethical research partnerships, this report is an excellent source. The second are watchdog groups like the Invisible Institute and Chicago Reporter, who build publicly accessible platforms for data on police misconduct acquired through Freedom of Information Act requests. The Invisible Institute hosts the Citizens Police Data Project, which Andy Papachristos used for his presentation, which takes records of police interactions with citizens and compiles them so the public has a record of misconduct for every officer. The Chicago Reporter hosts a database on police misconduct lawsuits, which tracks how much the city spends to settle lawsuits against officers. And they've been able to show how misconduct has cost the city nearly $500 million since 2005. To conclude, if there's one thing to take away from this presentation, it's the following question inspired by my students. Who or what defines success or failure when it comes to policing in Chicago? This question requires a fundamental process of democratizing the way Chicago defines its problems and solutions. Without democratization, the police and private entities with the most to lose from drastic reform or abolition will continue to monopolize the public's imagination for transforming public safety. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Robert, and thank you to all our presenters for a really fabulous set of talks that have produced a grand sum of 22 questions so far, and I'm sure a number more are going to come in as the discussion starts. So rather than posing your questions one by one, what I've tried to do is to collect them so that they can be directed in bunches to the different speakers. And I'm also going to shift the order a little because I think the discussion will flow a little bit better. I've also been told by Julian Go that if people are so inclined and if our speakers are available, we can go a little bit beyond the 3:30 end session. If any of the speakers can't do that, send me a note on the private chat. So let me begin with a series of questions that were directed towards Monica Bell. And these are questions about what it would mean to implement, indeed to institutionalize some of the principles that you laid out so compellingly in your presentation. We had a question about how would you go about making community engaged research a standard piece of core graduate training? How would that change how we train researchers? David Ball wondered what you would think of as an IRB for researchers who would want to avoid entanglement. What are the mechanisms, not only for enforcing that principle, but actually for providing guidance and mentorship as we sort of come to understand what's entailed by those principles?
Sure, those are great questions, and so one thing I wanted to start with, and I think is kind of an overarching question related to all of this is, so we've talked a lot about public safety in our conversation, and there has been inherently in that conversation this idea that the police are the providers of public safety. There's that link, and people so easily do it, and we're now in a broad way questioning that kind of link when community members say they want public safety, the assumption that means that we need to have more policing. that is one example of a failure in our epistemological training and in our graduate training that relates to these two specific questions. So more broadly, we should be encouraging graduate students, for example, and each other as scholars, we should be asking questions about the assumptions built in to the research questions we ask. So, I mean, we see this in other contexts too, like research on residential segregation. We assume that being apart is bad, as opposed to thinking about the processes that make the apartness bad. So specifically on these questions about community engaged research. So there's an assumption often in graduate programs that community engaged research is action research and is therefore less scholarly. There are these presumptions that if you actually work with communities to do something positive, then it's no longer scholarly. And so there are principles that undergird community-based research, participatory action research. There are decades of writing on participatory action research. And we should start thinking about that work as core to the training about what's possible methodologically in sociology. And sociologists also can improve that work. So if the concern is that it's not scholarly enough, there's something weird with the sample sizes, there's something strange about the selection, sociologists can actually help kind of be in conversation with that and improve our practice of that sort of work. Relatedly, there are lots of different ways to be community engaged. So that might be something like community engaged research that's like more action research, or it could be, Jens was talking about the difficulty of identifying which community organization. Well, if we think about community involvement as not being ancillary to our scientific goals, but actually core to them, then that could give us ways and space to early in graduate school be thinking about how to build those relationships and how to keep them from kind of overwhelming our scientific agenda. Quickly on the IRB point, because I could talk about this stuff forever. Quickly on the IRB point. So I will say part of the intention behind the letter was to start building a scholarly community that is tractable, and which we would ask each other, okay, so you're doing this research on policing, or you're doing research with police department, what sorts of variables are you looking at? What kind of proposals are you making? Are you making proposals that emanate from kind of a limited view of what public safety means, or are you so we're supposed to be interrogating each other? I love the idea of creating some sort of free-floating IRB or some kind of body that would help us disentangle that, and I think that's kind of what scholarly community is about. So I mean, I would love to be in conversation with David Ball about developing something like that, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Jens Ludwig, who cannot stay past 3:30, but quite a number of the questions were directed to you. So I will lay out a series of these, and you can pick and choose. And I hope that the whole set of questions will be made available to the participants. That's a comment to the tech people. So questions on engagement, on transparency, and on private funding. On engagement, one questioner suggested that the BAM participants are also part of the constituency for this research on policing that you've been doing. Do they inform your work as it unfolds? Do they have input into the studies? Are they an audience, a collaborator, a group of potential collaborators? We had a lot of questions on transparency, specifically about FOIA and whether the crime lab should be subject to FOIA, and a question about the role of contracts in the crime lab. I'll quote here. UChicago Crime Lab has provided some services for free to the Chicago Police Department, which then means that the city's inspector general cannot audit a contract that doesn't exist. What are these services, and should they in some ways be subjected to various institutional forms of transparency? And I'll just add one final small question about private funding. The discussion of foundations and corporate donations, as you laid out that argument, you emphasized how it makes possible treating government agencies as partners, not clients. But how do you think about the incentives of those private donors and maintain and avoid capture by their interests? A question I think that becomes particularly relevant in light of Robert's presentation.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so let me see how many of these I can take before I've got to jump off. So let me start off with the Inspector General. So everything that we do with the City of Chicago requires its own data sharing agreement and work scope that defines exactly what we're doing with the city. So the university itself has perfect visibility into that. And the city itself has some documentation for exactly what we're doing. But I think, we have we've decided the right thing to do is to have a cooperative rather than adversarial relationship with the city's Inspector General. So we are giving them updates about what we're doing. So they don't need to, go through any sort of formalistic or legalistic mechanism. I assume they also have visibility into all the data sharing agreements as well, but we've been very happy to have a bunch of presentations to them to keep them updated on what we're doing. In terms of addressing the comment about becoming a man and them as the BAM participants as constituents for what we do. So if you think about the larger Crime Lab enterprise, a few years ago, we also started the Education Lab as the sister organization to the Crime Lab. Education we think of as the flip side to all of the challenges with crime and criminal justice. So about 2/3 of our portfolio is not with criminal justice agencies. So we're not just working with youth guidance in the Becoming a Man program, but with dozens, if not hundreds, of community groups around the city. And so all of those interactions are informing the criminal justice part of our portfolio as well. And I think we wouldn't want to be an organization that was just working with the criminal justice system for that reason. I think, if I think about one of the structural problems with the police department in Chicago right now, is they don't have, at least in Chicago this is true, the city of Chicago doesn't have its own systematic mechanism for soliciting systematic feedback from the communities that they serve. And so this stands in really sharp contrast to, what we know is possible in policing as best practice. So for instance, if you look at the Metropolitan Police Department in London, they invest millions of dollars every year to do neighborhood level surveys of community sentiment towards the police services that neighborhoods are receiving. It seems to me like a huge tragedy that we don't have something similar to that here in the city of Chicago as well. And I think, I hope that the current moment pushes the city to invest resources into that, because I think one of the most basic ideas in economics is essentially what gets measured gets done. And so if the only thing the police department is incentivized on is to worry about measures of crime and arrests and guns and drugs confiscated, that's what the police department will worry about. If we have alongside that the police department's performance dashboards, if they also include some measure of local community sentiment, that is a way of completely reorienting what the police department does, at least aspirationally, and we've seen some signs of that in other cities around the country. Let me just close. I know we're running low on time. Let me close with two other quick points. One is on transparency and FOIA. I'm not sure who asked the question, but I wonder if the questioner actually understands how FOIA works. So Monica's a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer. So if I say anything that's incorrect now, I'm more than happy to be corrected. But my understanding of FOIA is it's a transparency mechanism for government agencies. And to the extent to which we have non-government agencies interacting with the government, the way that the public has visibility into that is by FOIA-ing all the correspondence that we have. And so every email that anyone at the crime lab ever sends to a government partner is sitting on a government partner email server that can be FOIA'd and has been FOIA'd and should be FOIA'd. So everything on the government email servers or hard drives, we send them with the full understanding that they can be FOIA'd, and that's part of the transparency regime. I think the last thing that I would just say is one of the other initiatives that we've been trying to think more and more about is how we democratize. This is a theme that came up in several of the presentations, how we can be part of the effort to democratize access to data. So one of the things that we do is, in the spirit of alternative to the justice system, Chicago is one of those cities around the country that has invested a lot of public sector resources into supporting community groups that do street outreach. And so there are lots of organizations doing that, particularly across the South and West sides. And so one of the things that we've invested a lot of effort into doing is working with the mayor's office to try and take a bunch of high frequency crime data from the police department that normally isn't made public or made public in some more aggregated way with a delay, and make that available in much more real time to the community organizations that are trying to do this work themselves. And I think we view that as sort of a first step towards this larger agenda, towards taking the data infrastructure that Chicago has built and that we've been trying to help build, and making that of greater use to lots and lots of different organizations and individuals all across the city as well. So with that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to drop off to my next call, but thanks again, everybody, for having me be part of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And the conversation will continue. Because I want there to be a little back and forth, I'm just going to pose one big question to Steve, one big question to Robert, and then allow those who remain to talk to one another. So Steve, one of the members of the audience asks, is there an analog for collective efficacy in police agency, or for co-producing collective efficacy by policy agencies in collaboration with community groups, research institutions, you name it? But is there a way in which we can take that body of literature and apply it to the challenge of rethinking what's possible in terms of reinventing policing?
You know, I can't put my finger on any research evidence about that question. I do think that we should think about the social practice of policing as it's institutionalized, and the role of police union contracts and how that shapes the social interactions that police have, as compared to at least the ideal of community policing, which was to create different kinds of social interaction with people who were in neighborhoods. Because the efficacy of the police to do their work is entirely connected with their capacity to interact with people and gain information and trust. Without information and trust, they can't do their jobs. And I can't imagine how they could feel a sense of efficacy if they don't. And if what they do is ride around in cars waiting for confrontations to develop and then going and interacting with those people and that's the social life they have with the community, then I can't imagine how their their sense of efficacy about being able to perform their work would be in any way supportive. So I think theoretically we can anticipate that the way that the institution of policing structures the interactions that police have with the people whose safety is really the product of their work must have a great deal to do with how efficacious they feel.
Thank you. And one question to Robert, with the note that there was a quite detailed question asking if you wanted to comment on the conflict and tensions between Latinx and Black residents of Little Village during the protests of the last few months, but that moves in a different direction. The question that is sort of directly on topic for, I think, the reinvention of policing is, given the sort of revelatory comments and data that you presented about private interests in the financing of policing, you focused on how those are obstacles to change, how those sort of are entrenched interests in maintaining policing as it is. How would you begin to think about how recognition of those interests might change what kind of demands and visions that those challenging policing as it actually exists are making? So is there an implication either for the strategies and tactics or the sort of goals and ideals of those movements to transform policing that comes once you recognize the depth and extent of those financial interests?
Yes. First, real quick on the Latinx question, there was a great article on this in the Southside Weekly that everyone should check out. I think that the way I look at this is, first, you have, by recognizing the financial embeddedness in policing work, it's useful for, first, I think, for movements to be able to map out the terrain. Because I think that when we think about this as an exclusively police-citizen or police community relations kind of thing, we totally lose sight of this big actor behind the curtain that's also at play. And so part of what a group that I'm working with are doing is trying to systematically compile these data, because we know that movements can have power through the power of boycott. And we know, for example, groups of companies are putting pressure on Facebook, right? Boycotting Facebook because of its wish to not censor fake news and the likes. And so I think that at the most, I mean, there's so much work to do. I mean, I feel like this is a great productive avenue for social science research that if folks are interested in pursuing, I'm more than happy to share all the data that we're amassing. But I think the short answer is that it helps to map the terrain to show who fully are the actors involved. Because I think I'll end up make one last point, is that police also don't like these tech companies. So my undergrad BA thesis advisee, Rachel Kim, wrote this amazing BA thesis on police officers and how they use this tech, and they hate it. They hate it because it's like one more thing on top of the 30-something odd gadgets they have to do. And so I think Wes Scogan made the point about how we shouldn't write off police officers as possible allies in movements for change. Because when you have conversations about these things, you might find collaborators or allies in unexpected places.
So let me end by posing one question that came to the panel as a whole. All of us who work for the University of Chicago work for an institution, a wealthy private institution that has its own police force. And I have to assume that the same is true of Yale University. Okay. How do you think about that? Yeah. Sort of, what is the stance that you would think about as citizens of universities that are also police powers?
So I have many thoughts about the Yale Police Department and its relationship with New Haven. I think the Yale Police Department was the first university police department. And it has played a particularly toxic role in New Haven, particularly kind of keeping New Haven away from Yale, like this kind of border patrol function that I've talked about in some of my most recent work. I think there are lots of better ways to produce public safety, especially in a university environment. I think we should, like, this is a particular way in which the university is complicit in a lot of racial violence that is unnecessary, and also that violence tends to run not just toward people who are external to the university, although that's critical, but also to students and people who are internal to the university. We've had incidents on our campus here at Yale that are troubling, and we will continue to have more. So I just think we need to also, it's actually really exciting because universities have, I think, more interesting ways to produce public safety. You know, it's less about how do you shift around funding from policing to schools. There's so many creative things that universities can do. So actually, I would love to see universities become laboratories for ways we can think more concretely about alternatives to standard policing.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think that, you know, the analogy, of course, it's not exact, but the fact is that we do run these 4 schools, that we are able to study. Hopefully, we're accountable to what's happening in those schools. The university is a place where, in principle, ideas and claims are uninhibited, unconstrained, where data can be collected, and where we can evaluate the University of Chicago police. And I don't think we've done that. I don't think we've ever, I'm not sure. It'd be very interesting actually to find out whether the university would be willing to do that and stand up for its principles. I think it's worth a try. That, you know, we have some evidence that they don't really want us to study the lab school. So maybe it'll be a problem. So we'll have to find out.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with my co-panelists. I find it deeply troubling. I find it, crippling for trying to recruit diverse graduate students, particularly Black men, to our PhD programs because of the heightened presence that police force gives to them. And the way I think about this is the way that, I mean, really, I think private police represent a real frontier in the battles to come, because I think if abolition movements are successful, I can imagine a world where we have the Albany Park private police department or the Hyde Park police, and you go on, et cetera, et cetera. You have like smaller communities. You might even have communities try to secede from cities, which is something that has happened before. And so I think that's a way to say that we need more knowledge and need more knowledge to inform the tactics and the strategies to fight that terrain. And I wish I spent more time with lawyers, because I feel like, okay, the police are this private entity. Does that mean that citizens become customers? And if we're customers, does that mean that we can file lawsuits on the basis of the position of a customer? Or like there's a phrase, the customer's always right. So like it's a warped sense of logics, but that's what you're forced to do, and that's the kind of thinking we have to do if we're going to try to make these institutions better.
Thank you for ending on that challenge to all of us who live in and around this institution. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Julian Go and the entire tech crew who have put the conference together, and the final session, which will deal much more with engaged research with partners outside of the university, will happen a little later this afternoon. So thank you to you all.